Hey everyone, this is Jerry with San Pedro Mastery. The San Pedro, as well as the other cacti in the Trichocereus family, such as the Bolivian Torch or the Peruvian Torch, respond fairly well to fertilizers, in the sense that they will grow noticeably faster. However, using fertilizer is absolutely not necessary, as these cacti grow already quite fast without any help. In this video, I will present you different options on fertilizers, as well as earthworm castings, which I can already tell you is the best option, at least in my opinion. On the image that appears now, you can see two different fertilizers. The bottle on the left is chemical, the one on the right is organic. By the way, I'm absolutely not recommending any of these products. They're okay, I suppose, but nothing out of the extraordinary. Cactus fertilizers can be either chemical or organic. Obviously, I recommend the organic kind, especially since there are people who eat the San Pedro to experience its psychedelic effects. Even if you have absolutely no intention of doing that yourself, you may end up selling or giving a plant to someone who may want to consume it. For that reason, I recommend you not to use chemical fertilizers. If you must use chemical fertilizers, then limit their use to seedlings, of course with mild dosages, like a quarter or a third of the recommended dosage on the bottle. Needless to say, I'm not talking about freshly born seedlings. You don't want to give those any fertilizer. At the very least, they need to have grown some spines. And do not use chemical fertilizers on anything bigger than seedlings, as they may contain toxic chemicals that can be stored in the plant tissues long term. As a side note, if you buy a San Pedro from a cactus nursery, assume that it has been fed with chemical fertilizers, as many of these places try to optimize profit. Before you buy fertilizer, check whether or not your potting soil already has fertilizer in it. If it does, then you probably don't want to add any more and over-fertilize your San Pedro. For the same reason, you're better off to use liquid fertilizer, which you mix with water, rather than pellets, which are easy to use but harder to dose. I would also suggest using less fertilizer than the amount recommended on the bottle. Some people like to add a very small amount of fertilizer every time they water, instead of a bigger amount periodically, to avoid the occasional burst of growth every time you fertilize, which can lead to irregular growth. Each fertilizer comes with an NPK number. N stands for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium. An NPK number of 555 means that the fertilizer contains 5% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, and 5% potassium. For a cactus, you want the first number, which is nitrogen, to be lower than the other two numbers. Nitrogen is largely responsible for the growth, which is why most fertilizers contain a lot of it. And unfortunately, that includes the majority of cactus fertilizers, as the manufacturers hope you will be impressed by the results, and therefore you will buy some more. Nitrogen on a cactus will result in fast growth, but unfortunately also weaker defenses, which implies the cactus will be more prone to rotting, especially younger plants. This is why it is important to choose a fertilizer that has a nitrogen value lower than the following two values. For instance, take that bottle on the left. Even though it is chemical, it has an excellent NPK number of 4, 8, 12. That is the same NPK ratio as 1, 2, 3, but in larger proportions. The organic fertilizer on the right has a not so great NPK number of 3, 1.5, 5. And that is quite common with organic fertilizers, as the NPK depends on the natural products they used. In this case, apparently, fermented beet pulp. In contrast with the chemical fertilizer, it is easy for the manufacturer to get the exact ratio they want. You will find that general-purpose fertilizers are usually cheaper than cactus fertilizers. But those often have a high nitrogen value. Then again, it is not an issue if you use lower doses. Like I said at the beginning, I don't personally like fertilizer. The only fertilizer I sometimes use is a natural one, earthworm castings, and that works wonderfully on the San Pedro. Earthworm castings come in very large bags and are fairly cheap. Well, at least they are here in Barcelona. You mix the casting with the soil when you repot, and then afterwards you don't have to do anything. The fertilizer is part of the soil and remains there. Much like liquid fertilizers, earthworm castings can be very powerful and even harm the plant if too much is used. I once repotted 24 adult San Pedro cuttings with earthworm castings in the mix, and the 3/4 of the cuttings ended up rotting from the base. Let me explain what happened. When you repot a cutting, after a few months, the part that is under the soil will cork and roots will develop. Until the cork has formed, the green tissue that is below the surface of the soil is very vulnerable. Too much fertilizer can make it rot. And indeed, in that instance, I'd put a lot of earthworm castings in the mix. I learned from my mistake. If you have a Trichocereus cutting that has not been in the soil and has not corked yet, then I would not add earthworm castings to the soil, nor any other type of fertilizer. However, if it has already corked and rooted, then you could possibly add some earthworm castings up to about 25%. A typical mix with earthworm castings would be 2 parts potting soil, 1 part perlite, 1 part earthworm castings. Usually, the way I like to use earthworm castings is to revive old soil. For instance, after I've grown tomatoes, then the soil is usually emptied of nutrients. These are my tomatoes, by the way. So instead of throwing the old soil away, I add about 25% earthworm castings to it, and the soil becomes fertile again and can be reused. In last week's video, someone in the comments section asked me what I thought of store-bought compost or homemade one as a soil additive or a top dressing. I have no experience of store-bought compost, but homemade one can be a great addition. I used to make my own organic compost years ago using a composter. I would add compost to old used soil to give it new life. That worked very well for the San Pedro. However, once I didn't wait quite long enough before using it. It was not fully composted, and some of my plants suffered from it. So if you make it yourself, be very patient and wait until it is fully composted before using it. Also, the compost pile attracted fungus gnats, which is not very good if you are growing seedlings nearby. Now I just purchased earthworm castings. But yes, compost is a great alternative. As a soil additive, my recipe would be 1 part compost, 2 parts potting soil, 1 part perlite. As a top dressing, that would work too if you don't want to repot, although obviously it's not going to be as efficient as if you mix it into the soil. There are also other types of fertilizers, and if you've had good or bad experience with them, please share it with us in the comment section below.